The harvest would rot in the fields if Quinn O'Brien didn't find help soon, and he knew it as surely as he knew his own name. August of 1877 had arrived in Independence, Missouri, with scorching heat and cloudless skies. Perfect weather for bringing in the wheat that stretched across his 200 acres like an ocean of gold. But perfect weather meant nothing when a man worked alone, when every other able hand in 3 counties was already spoken for, already committed to their own farms or the larger spreads that could pay wages he couldn't match. Quinn stood at the edge of his field that morning, sweat already soaking through his cotton shirt though the sun had barely cleared the horizon, and wondered if this would be the year he lost everything his father had built. He was 26 years old, broad-shouldered and strong, but even the strongest man had limits. His father had died 2 winters past, pneumonia taking him quick and merciless, and his mother had followed before spring, her heart simply giving out from grief. The farm had been Quinn's responsibility ever since, and he'd managed well enough through planting season, but harvest demanded more than one man could give. He needed someone who knew their way around hard work, someone willing to labor from sunup to sundown for a share of whatever the wheat brought at market. He'd asked everyone he could think of, had even posted notices in town, but Independence was growing fast and opportunities were plentiful for those who wanted them. Nobody wanted to break their back in a wheat field when they could work in town, or head west with one of the wagon trains that came through regular. Quinn was about to head back to the barn, to face another day of doing what he could alone, when he saw the figure walking up the long road that led to his property. At first he thought it might be a trick of the early light, heat shimmer rising off the packed dirt even though the real heat of the day hadn't settled in yet. But the figure kept coming, resolute and steady, and as it drew closer, Quinn realized with a start that it was a woman. She wore men's work clothes, trousers and a loose shirt, both faded and dusty from travel. A wide-brimmed hat shaded her face, and she carried a bedroll over one shoulder and a canvas sack in her other hand. Everything about her spoke of someone who'd been on the road for a while. Quinn walked to meet her, curiosity overriding the desperation that had been his constant companion for weeks. She stopped a respectful distance away and pushed her hat back, revealing a face that was sun-browned and striking, with eyes so dark they were nearly black and hair the color of rich soil pulled back in a practical braid. She looked to be in her early 20s, and there was something in the set of her jaw that spoke of determination and no small amount of stubbornness. "You Quinn O'Brien?" she asked, her voice clear and direct, no nonsense about it. "I am," he said, then added, "Who's asking?" "My name is Winona Parker. I saw your notice in town 3 days ago, the one about needing harvest help." Quinn blinked, taken aback. "That notice was from 2 weeks past. I figured nobody was coming. I was working a job south of here, couldn't leave until it was finished." She set down her sack but kept her bedroll on her shoulder. "The notice said you were offering a percentage of the profits instead of wages. That's still the offer." "It is," Quinn said slowly, his mind racing. He'd never worked with a woman before, not in the fields. Women in Independence worked plenty hard, but usually in their own homes, their own gardens, sometimes in the shops in town. Field work, especially harvest work, was brutal. Still, she'd come all this way, and he was desperate enough to consider anything. "You ever worked a harvest before?" Something flashed in Winona's dark eyes, something that might have been irritation or amusement, hard to tell. "I've worked every harvest since I was 12 years old. My father had a farm up in Iowa, lost it 4 years back when the bank called in his loans. I've been hiring out ever since, going farm to farm, doing whatever work needs doing. I can cut wheat, bind sheaves, load wagons, drive a team, and I don't slow down when the sun gets high. I don't complain, I don't quit, and I don't cause trouble. What I do is work, Mr. O'Brien, and I do it better than most men you'll find." There was no boasting in her voice, just plain statement of fact. Quinn studied her, noting the calluses visible on her hands, the strength in her forearms, the way she stood like someone who was used to being on her feet all day. He thought about his fields, about the wheat that would start dropping seed in another week if he didn't get it cut, about the debt he owed at the bank, and the supplies he'd need to buy for winter. He thought about how he'd lain awake last night, calculating and recalculating, trying to figure out if he could possibly do it alone. 15% of whatever the harvest brings, he said. You'll work sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week. Sundays off for rest and church if you're so inclined. I can't pay wages on top of that, but I can provide room and board. There's a small cabin out past the barn. It's not much, but it's clean and weatherproof. Meals 3 times a day. We'll eat simple, but there'll be enough of it. Winona nodded slowly. 20% and you have a deal. Quinn almost smiled despite himself. You don't bargain small, do you? A percentage of nothing is nothing, Mr. O'Brien. I'm betting on your fields being as good as they look from here, and I'm betting on my own ability to help you bring it all in before it spoils. If I do that, if I work as hard as I say I can, then I'll have earned 20%. If your harvest fails, I get nothing anyway, so it's not much of a risk for you. She was right, and they both knew it. Quinn extended his hand. 20%. We have a deal. Winona's hand was calloused and strong, her grip firm. When do we start? Soon as you're settled in, Quinn said. Come on, I'll show you the cabin. The cabin sat beneath a spreading oak tree about 50 yards from the main barn, far enough to offer privacy but close enough to be convenient. It had been his grandfather's place, built when the old man had gotten too cantankerous to live in the main house but too stubborn to move to town. It was a single room with a stone fireplace, a rope bed, a small table and 2 chairs, and not much else. But the roof was sound, the door hung straight, and the windows had glass in them, which was more than could be said for a lot of places. There's a well between here and the barn, Quinn said, standing in the doorway while Winona looked around. Water's good and cold. Outhouse is behind the cabin. I'll expect you up at the main house for breakfast at 5. We'll work until noon, break for dinner and rest during the worst heat, then work again until we lose the light. That's fine, Winona said, setting her bedroll on the bed. I'll be there at 5. Quinn hesitated, something making him linger. Miss Parker, I should tell you, there might be talk in town about you staying here working with me. People can be narrow-minded about such things. Winona turned to face him, and there was steel in her expression. Mr. O'Brien, I've been on my own for 4 years. I've heard every kind of talk there is. What people say doesn't matter to me. What matters is the work and whether you'll pay what you promised when it's done. Will you? I will, Quinn said. Then we don't have a problem. She paused, then added more gently, but I appreciate the warning. Quinn nodded and left her to settle in. As he walked back to the house, he felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. It took him a moment to recognize it as hope. They started the next morning in the coolness before dawn, Quinn showing Winona how he'd set up the equipment, where he wanted to start cutting, how he planned to organize the work. She listened carefully, asked a few pointed questions that showed she understood what needed doing, then picked up a scythe and got to work. Quinn watched her for the first few minutes, half expecting her to struggle or slow down, but she moved through the wheat with steady, practiced strokes, her rhythm even and efficient. By the time the sun was fully up, he'd stopped watching and started working himself, falling into the familiar meditation of harvest work, the swing and cut, swing and cut. the whisper of falling wheat and the sweet, dusty smell of it all around them. They worked in silence mostly, saving their breath for the labor. The heat built as morning progressed, the sun beating down merciless and bright. Sweat soaked Quinn's shirt and ran down his face, stinging his eyes. He glanced over at Winona and saw she was flushed and sweating too, but her pace hadn't slowed. She'd tied a bandana around her forehead to keep the sweat from her eyes, and her jaw was set with concentration. Something about her determination made him want to work harder, to prove he could match her stroke for stroke. By the time they broke for dinner at noon, they'd cut a significant portion of the first field, more than Quinn had managed in 3 days working alone. He felt it in his back and shoulders, that deep ache that came from good hard work, and he suspected Winona felt it too, though she gave no sign of it. They walked back to the house together, not talking much, too tired and hot for conversation. Quinn had prepared a simple meal the night before, knowing they'd both be too exhausted to cook. Cold chicken, fresh bread, sliced tomatoes from his garden, and cool water from the spring house. They sat on the porch in the shade, eating with the single-minded focus of people who'd burned through their breakfast hours ago. The heat of the day pressed down on them, the cicadas singing their endless summer song in the trees. "You were right," Quinn said finally, breaking the comfortable silence. "You know your way around harvest work." Winona wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "Told you I did. Most people say a lot of things, doesn't mean they're all true." "I don't see the point in lying," Winona said. "The truth comes out eventually anyway. Might as well start with it." Quinn found himself studying her profile, the strong line of her jaw, the way wisps of dark hair had escaped her braid and curled around her face. There was something compelling about her directness, her lack of artifice. Most women he knew in independence wore their femininity like armor, all corseted propriety and careful manners. Winona wore her capability instead, and somehow that was more attractive than any amount of practiced charm. "How'd you end up on your own?" he asked, then immediately worried he'd overstepped. "Sorry, that's not my business," Winona shrugged. "It's not a secret. My father lost the farm, like I said. Bank took everything. He'd been sick, couldn't work as hard as he used to, and the loans just piled up. After we lost the place, he and my mother went to live with my brother in Chicago. He's got a job in a factory there, makes enough to support them all. They wanted me to come too, but I couldn't stand the thought of it. All those buildings, all those people pressed together. I'm a farm girl. I need space around me, need to see the horizon. So I took what little money I had and started hiring out. Figured I'd work my way west eventually, maybe find a place where land is still cheap enough to buy." "That's a hard way to live," Quinn said quietly. "It is," Winona agreed. "But it's honest work, and I'm beholden to no one. That's worth something." They sat in silence for a while longer, resting before the afternoon's work. Quinn found himself wanting to ask more questions, to learn more about this woman who'd appeared on his road like an answer to a prayer he hadn't quite voiced. But the sun was already starting its descent toward afternoon, and the wheat wouldn't wait. The days fell into a pattern after that. Up before dawn, quick breakfast, then out to the fields. They worked in the relative cool of morning, pushed through the brutal heat of midday as much as they could stand, rested during the worst hours, then worked again until twilight made it too dark to see. The wheat fell before them in golden waves, and slowly, steadily, the fields emptied and the barn filled with sheaves waiting to be threshed. It was hard work, relentless and demanding, but there was a satisfaction in it too, in seeing the tangible results of their labor, in knowing that every day brought them closer to securing the harvest. Quinn found himself increasingly aware of Winona's presence, of the way she moved through the work with such quiet competence. She never complained, never slacked off, never asked for special treatment. When something heavy needed lifting, she grabbed her end without waiting to be asked. When the scythe needed sharpening, she knew how to do it as well as he did. She was, in every way that mattered, the partner he'd needed but never thought to find. He caught himself watching her sometimes, when she didn't know he was looking. The way she'd pause to wipe her face with her bandana, or stretch out her back with her hands pressed to her spine. The way she'd smile slightly when a cool breeze would blow through the field, offering momentary relief from the heat. She wasn't beautiful in the conventional way, but there was something about her that drew his eye, something strong and real that made the carefully coiffed women in town seem somehow less. One evening, about 2 weeks into the harvest, they were finishing up for the day when Quinn's scythe blade caught on a rock hidden in the stubble, and the handle cracked with a sharp report. He swore under his breath, examining the damage. The handle had split near the blade, not quite broken through but weakened enough that it wouldn't last another day. "I've got wood in the barn," he said, more to himself than to Winona. "I can make a new handle, but it'll take most of the evening." "I can help," Winona offered. 4 hands make lighter work. They walked back to the barn together in the purple twilight, and Quinn lit the lanterns while Winona examined the broken scythe. He pulled out the wood he'd been saving, good straight-grained ash, and started marking where he'd need to cut. Winona found his spokeshave and started smoothing down the rough stock, her movements practiced and sure. "You know woodworking too?" Quinn asked, impressed despite himself. "My father taught me," Winona said. "He said skills were the only things nobody could take from you." Taught me everything he could before the farm went under. They worked together in companionable silence, the barn filled with the smell of fresh wood shavings and lamp oil. Quinn found himself intensely aware of how close she was, how their shoulders would sometimes brush as they worked. The air between them seemed charged with something he couldn't quite name, something that made his heart beat faster. "Quinn," Winona said softly, and it was the first time she'd used his given name. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," he said, not looking up from the wood he was shaping. "Why'd you never marry? Man like you with land and a good reputation, I'd think you'd have your pick of women in town." Quinn paused, considering his answer. "I guess I never met anyone who understood this life. Farm life, I mean. It's hard and uncertain, and you have to love it for itself, not for what you hope it might become. Most women I've met want security, want guarantees I can't give. The land provides or it doesn't. The rains come or they don't. You work and hope and pray, and sometimes it's enough and sometimes it's not. That kind of uncertainty scares people." "It doesn't scare me," Winona said quietly. Quinn looked up and found her watching him, her dark eyes steady in the lamplight. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that went deeper than words. He opened his mouth to respond, but Winona had already turned back to her work, and the moment slipped away like water through his fingers. They finished the handle well after full dark, and Quinn walked Winona back to her cabin. The night was warm, the air heavy with the scent of wheat and earth. Fireflies danced in the darkness, and somewhere an owl called, "Hunting." "Thank you," Quinn said when they reached her door. "For the help with the handle, I mean, and for everything else. I couldn't do this without you." Winona smiled, and in the moonlight she looked almost ethereal. "We're partners in this, Quinn. That means we help each other. Partners." The word resonated in Quinn's chest as he walked back to the main house. It was true, they were partners, but somewhere along the way, he'd started wanting more than that. He'd started imagining what it might be like if she stayed after the harvest, if she became a permanent part of his life instead of just a temporary solution to a seasonal problem. The thought both thrilled and terrified him. The harvest continued through late August and into September. The weather held fair, which was both blessing and curse. The wheat stayed dry and easy to cut, but the heat was relentless, draining them both. They developed a rhythm, an unspoken understanding of how to work together most efficiently. Quinn would start a row and Winona would take the one beside it, and they'd work their way across the field in parallel lines. Sometimes they'd talk as they worked, sharing stories about their pasts, their families, their dreams. Other times they'd work in silence, each lost in their own thoughts but aware of the other's presence. Quinn learned that Winona loved thunderstorms, that she could identify birds by their calls, that she had a dry sense of humor that caught him off guard and made him laugh. He learned that she was 23 years old, that her favorite food was apple pie, that she'd once broken her arm falling out of a tree and had set it herself because the nearest doctor was 2 days away. Every detail felt precious, something to be stored away and treasured. Winona learned that Quinn played the fiddle, though he hadn't touched it since his parents died. That he'd wanted to be a teacher when he was young, but the farm had needed him more than any classroom. That he still missed his parents with an ache that sometimes caught him off guard, usually at twilight when the day's work was done and the house felt too empty. That he was kind and patient and funny in a quiet way that snuck up on her. One Sunday, their day of rest, Quinn worked up the courage to ask Winona if she'd like to go into town with him. He needed supplies from the general store, and he thought she might enjoy the outing. To his surprise and pleasure, she agreed readily. Independence was bustling when they arrived mid-morning, the streets busy with people doing their Sunday shopping and socializing. Quinn was very aware of the looks they got, him and Winona walking side by side. Some people nodded politely, some whispered behind their hands, and a few looked openly disapproving. Quinn felt his jaw tighten with anger on Winona's behalf, but she seemed completely unbothered, her head high and her expression serene. They made their way to Morrison's general store, where George Morrison greeted Quinn with his usual friendliness. His eyes slid to Winona with undisguised curiosity. "Quinn, good to see you," George said. "Heard you found help with the harvest." "I did," Quinn said evenly. "George Morrison, this is Winona Parker. She's been working with me the past few weeks." "Miss Parker," George said, nodding politely but with reservation clear in his voice. "Mr. Morrison," Winona replied, her tone neutral. Quinn bought the supplies he needed: bacon and flour and coffee, some sugar and salt. As George was tallying up the cost, his wife Martha emerged from the back room. She was a plump, pink-cheeked woman who ran the church auxiliary and considered herself the moral compass of independence. "Quinn O'Brien," she said, her voice sharp with disapproval. "I'm surprised to see you in town. I'd think you'd want to keep a lower profile given the circumstances." Quinn felt heat rise in his face, but before he could respond, Winona spoke up, her voice calm but with an edge of steel underneath. "Madam, I'm not sure what circumstances you're referring to, but I assure you everything is perfectly proper. Mr. O'Brien hired me to help with his harvest, which I've been doing. I have my own cabin, we work during the day, and everything is as respectable as any other employment arrangement." Martha's face pinched with displeasure. "A young woman, living alone on a man's property, no chaperone or family nearby. It's unseemly no matter how you try to dress it up. People talk, Miss Parker. They talk and they judge, and rightfully so." "Then let them talk," Winona said, her dark eyes flashing. "I'm not interested in living my life according to the narrow dictates of people who have never had to work a day as hard as I work every day. I'm not doing anything wrong, and neither is Mr. O'Brien." If people want to make something ugly out of something honest, that says more about them than it does about us. The store had gone quiet, other customers listening with poorly concealed interest. Martha looked like she'd swallowed something sour, and George looked distinctly uncomfortable. Quinn found himself fighting the urge to cheer. Instead, he picked up his supplies and placed money on the counter. "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Morrison," he said with exaggerated politeness. "But Miss Parker is right. Our arrangement is honest work, nothing more and nothing less. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have things to do." They left the store together, and once they were outside, Quinn let out a long breath. "I'm sorry about that. Martha Morrison means well, I suppose, but she's got more opinions than sense sometimes." "Don't apologize," Winona said. "I told you. I've dealt with worse. Besides, I meant what I said. I'm not ashamed of working for my living, and I'm not going to pretend I am just to make narrow-minded people comfortable." Quinn looked at her, standing there in the bright September sunshine, her chin raised defiantly and her eyes blazing with righteous indignation, and felt something shift in his chest. It was more than attraction, more than respect, though it was both of those things. It was the recognition of a kindred spirit, someone who understood not just the work he did but the values he held, someone who wouldn't bend just because bending was easier. "You're remarkable," he said before he could think better of it. "You know that." Winona's expression softened and color rose in her cheeks. "I'm just stubborn, that's all." "No," Quinn said seriously. "You're strong. There's a difference." They stood there for a moment, the busy street flowing around them, people passing on both sides. Something hung between them, something fragile and precious, and Quinn could feel the weight of it, the potential of it. Then Winona smiled, really smiled, and the moment settled into something warm and comfortable. "Come on," she said. "Let's get these supplies back to the farm. We've got a harvest to finish." The last week of harvest was always the hardest. The easy fields were done, and what remained was the difficult terrain, the corners where the wheat grew thinner, the spots where rocks made cutting treacherous. Quinn's back ached constantly, and he knew Winona must be feeling the same, though she never complained. They were both running on determination, and the knowledge that the end was in sight. One afternoon, as they were working a particularly difficult patch near the creek, Winona's scythe caught on something and she stumbled, catching herself but dropping the tool. Quinn was beside her in an instant, his hand on her elbow. "You all right?" he asked, concerned. "I'm fine," she said, but he could hear the exhaustion in her voice. "Just clumsy." Quinn looked at her more closely and saw the shadows under her eyes, the tightness around her mouth that spoke of someone pushing past their limits. "We should take a break," he said. "Come on, let's sit by the creek for a few minutes." Winona looked like she wanted to argue, but she let him lead her to the creek bank where willows provided some shade. They sat side by side on the grass, and Quinn pulled off his boots and dipped his feet in the cool water. After a moment, Winona did the same, sighing with relief. "This is nice," she said quietly. "It is," Quinn agreed. He watched the water flow past, clear and cold even in the late summer heat. "Winona, I've been meaning to talk to you about something." She turned to look at him, her expression wary. "All right." Quinn took a deep breath, gathering his courage. This was harder than any physical labor, laying his heart bare like this. "The harvest is almost done. Another few days, maybe a week at most, and we'll have it all in. Then it'll need to be threshed and taken to market, and after that, there won't be much work until spring planting. I know you've been traveling, hiring out from place to place. I know you've got your own plans, your own dreams about heading west and finding your own land." "Quinn," Winona said softly, but he pressed on, needing to get it all out. "Let me finish, please. These past weeks, working with you, getting to know you, it's been the best time I've had since my parents died. Maybe even before that. You're smart and capable and honest, and you're not afraid of hard work or hard truths. You're everything I didn't know I was looking for, and I can't imagine going back to working this farm alone. Not now. Not after this. He paused, his heart hammering in his chest. Winona was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, her dark eyes searching his face. "What are you saying, Quinn?" she asked, though he thought she probably knew. "I'm saying I don't want you to leave when the harvest is done. I'm saying I want you to stay, not as hired help but as my partner. My true partner in every sense of the word. I'm saying I've fallen in love with you, Winona Parker, and if you feel even a fraction of the same way, I'm asking you to stay. Marry me. Build a life here with me. We'll work the farm together, make it something better than it's ever been. I can't offer you an easy life, but I can offer you an honest one, and I can promise I'll spend every day trying to make you happy." The words hung in the air between them, and Quinn felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he'd never been before. Winona sat very still, her feet in the water, her hands folded in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "You have no idea how many times I've wanted to hear words like that," she said. "How many nights I've lain in that cabin wondering if I was imagining things, if maybe you felt the same way I do. I've been on my own for so long, Quinn. 4 years of wandering, never belonging anywhere, always moving on to the next job, the next place. I told myself I liked it that way, like being independent, but the truth is I was lonely. So lonely it was like an ache in my bones." She turned to look at him directly, and there were tears in her eyes. "Then I came here and everything changed. Working beside you every day, sharing meals on your porch, talking in the barn while we fixed that scythe handle, it all felt so right. Like I'd finally found the place I was meant to be. And you, Quinn O'Brien, you're the finest man I've ever known. You're kind and hard-working and decent, and yes, I've fallen in love with you too, so completely that it scares me sometimes." Quinn's heart soared, but he could hear a but coming. "What's holding you back?" he asked gently. Winona wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I don't want you to think I'm marrying you for security, for a place to belong. I don't want you to ever wonder if I would have said yes if I wasn't tired of traveling, if I wasn't worn down from being on my own." Quinn reached out and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Winona, look at me." When she did, he said firmly, "I know you. I know you're not someone who does anything for the wrong reasons. If you say yes, it's because you want to say yes, because you love me and want to build a life with me. That's all I need to know. The rest, all your reasons and motivations, those are yours and I trust them because I trust you." A tear rolled down Winona's cheek and then she was smiling, a brilliant, beautiful smile that made Quinn's breath catch. "Then yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll stay. Yes to all of it, Quinn, yes." He pulled her close and kissed her, tasting salt from her tears and the sweetness beneath. She kissed him back with an intensity that matched his own, her arms coming around his neck, holding him tight. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Quinn rested his forehead against hers. "We should probably finish the harvest before we start planning a wedding," he said, making her laugh. "Practical as always," she teased, but her eyes were warm with love. They finished the last of the harvest in a haze of happiness, working with renewed energy despite their exhaustion. Every shared glance held new meaning now. Every accidental touch was charged with promise. The wheat came in clean and dry, the best harvest Quinn had seen in years, and he knew it was because of Winona, because of her partnership and skill and determination. When the last sheaf was cut and loaded onto the wagon, They stood together in the empty field and looked at what they'd accomplished. The land stretched out around them, stubble and earth instead of waving wheat, but there was beauty in it still. The beauty of work completed, of challenges met and overcome. "We did it," Winona said softly, taking Quinn's hand. "We did," he agreed, squeezing her fingers. "Together." The threshing took another week, and then Quinn loaded up the wagon and made the trip to the grain merchant in Kansas City, a 2-day journey there and back. He took his fiddle with him, thinking maybe it was time to make music again, to celebrate instead of mourn. Winona stayed behind to mind the farm, and Quinn missed her every mile of the journey, missed her presence beside him, missed her laugh and her sharp observations and the way she made everything seem possible. The grain merchant was pleased with the quality of the wheat and paid a fair price. Quinn did the calculations in his head on the ride home, factoring in his debts and expenses and Winona's 20% share. It would be a comfortable winter, the best he'd had in years, and there would be enough left over to buy some things they'd need. A good plow, maybe some chickens to expand the flock, definitely a new dress for Winona because he'd never seen her in anything but work clothes, and he wanted to give her something fine. When he pulled into the yard 2 days later, Winona came out to meet him, and the sight of her made his heart leap. She'd clearly been working while he was gone. There was fresh whitewash on the barn and the garden had been weeded, but she'd stopped whatever she was doing when she heard the wagon. "How did it go?" she called as he climbed down. "Better than I hoped," Quinn said, pulling her into an embrace despite being dusty from the road. "We did well, Winona, really well." He told her the numbers, watched her eyes widen when she calculated her share. "That's more than I've made in a year of hiring out," she said, stunned. "You earned every penny," Quinn said firmly. "I couldn't have done any of it without you, and speaking of which, I have something for you." He went to the wagon and pulled out a package wrapped in brown paper. Winona opened it carefully and gasped when she saw what was inside. It was fabric, beautiful blue calico, enough for a dress, and with it was a length of white lace for trim. "Quinn, this is too much," she protested, but he could see the delight in her eyes. "Nothing is too much for my future wife," he said. "Besides, I was hoping you'd wear it when we get married, unless you'd rather have something else." Winona clutched the fabric to her chest. "It's perfect. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever owned." They set the wedding date for October, after the harvest was completely finished and sold, after they'd had time to rest and prepare. Quinn wanted to do it right, wanted to give Winona the kind of wedding she deserved. They went to town together to talk to the minister, a kind older man named Reverend Thompson, who seemed genuinely happy for them and showed none of the judgment Martha Morrison had displayed. "It's good to see you moving forward, Quinn," Reverend Thompson said warmly. "Your parents would be pleased. And Miss Parker, welcome to Independence. I hope you'll find a home here." "I already have," Winona said, smiling at Quinn. They invited the few people Quinn considered true friends, people who'd stood by him after his parents died, people who'd offered help even when they didn't have much to give. Tom and Sarah Jenkins, who farmed the neighboring property. Doc Hartley, who tried so hard to save Quinn's father. The Tanners, an older couple who owned the livery stable and had always treated Quinn fairly. Not a large group, but good people, the kind you wanted around you for important moments. Winona sewed her dress in the evenings, sitting on the porch of her cabin with Quinn beside her, sometimes playing his fiddle while she worked. He'd started playing again, finding that music came easier now, that the melancholy that had silenced him for so long had lifted. He played jigs and reels, hymns and ballads, and Winona would hum along sometimes, her fingers never pausing in their work. "My mother used to sew like that," Quinn said one evening, watching the needle flash in the lamplight. She could make anything, turn scraps into something beautiful. She would have liked you, I think. I wish I could have met her, Winona said. Met both your parents. They raised a good man. They did their best, Quinn said. Just like I'll do my best for you, for any children we might have. That's all any of us can do, right? Our best, and hope it's enough. Winona set down her sewing and reached for his hand. It will be enough, Quinn. We'll make it enough together. The wedding took place on a bright October morning, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. The leaves were turning, gold and red and orange, and the sky was that particular shade of blue that only came in fall. They were married in the small church in Independence, with Reverend Thompson officiating and their small group of friends as witnesses. Winona wore her blue calico dress and looked so beautiful it made Quinn's throat tight. She'd woven wildflowers into her dark braid, and her eyes shone with happiness. Quinn wore his best suit, the one he'd worn to his father's funeral, but he'd had it cleaned and pressed and didn't let himself think about sadness today. Today was about beginnings, not endings, about the life he and Winona would build together. Do you, Quinn O'Brien, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? Reverend Thompson asked. I do, Quinn said, his voice steady and sure. And do you, Winona Parker, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? I do, Winona said, and her smile could have lit the world. They exchanged simple gold bands that Quinn had bought with part of his harvest money, and when Reverend Thompson pronounced them husband and wife, Quinn kissed her with all the love and promise he felt swelling in his chest. Their friends clapped and cheered, and Sarah Jenkins was crying happy tears, and it was perfect in its simplicity. They had a small celebration at the Jenkins farm afterward, with food and music and good conversation. Quinn played his fiddle and Tom Jenkins played his harmonica, and there was dancing in the afternoon sunshine. Quinn danced with his bride, holding her close, feeling like the luckiest man in Missouri. Happy, he murmured into her ear. Happier than I knew I could be, Winona replied, and he felt her smile against his shoulder. As evening approached, they said their goodbyes and headed home, walking hand in hand down the road that led to the farm. Their farm now, both of theirs together. Winona had moved her few belongings into the main house the day before, and Quinn had done his best to make it welcoming, to make it feel like a home instead of just a place he lived. That night, in the privacy of their bedroom, they came together as husband and wife with tenderness and passion, learning each other in this new way. Quinn had been with women before, quick encounters that meant little, but this was different. This mattered. Winona was his partner, his equal, his love, and every touch was an act of devotion. She was equally inexperienced with true intimacy, and they learned together, laughed together at awkward moments, found joy and pleasure in the discovery. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Winona curled against his side, Quinn felt a contentment so deep it almost frightened him. He'd grown accustomed to loss, to things being taken away, and the happiness he felt now seemed almost too fragile to trust. What are you thinking? Winona asked softly, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest. That I'm afraid, Quinn admitted. Afraid something will happen to take this away from me, take you away from me. Winona propped herself up on her elbow, looking down at him in the moonlight that filtered through the window. Nothing is going to take me away from you, Quinn O'Brien. I'm here and I'm staying, and that's a promise I intend to keep. We'll face whatever comes together, the good and the bad, and we'll get through it because that's what partners do. That's what people in love do. "I love you," Quinn said, needing to say it, needing her to hear it. "I love you too," Winona replied and kissed him, soft and sweet. "Now go to sleep. Tomorrow we start building our life together, and I have big plans for that chicken coop. It's a disgrace." Quinn laughed, the last of his fear dissipating in the face of such practical love. "Yes, madam." The first year of their marriage passed in a rhythm of work and seasons, challenges and small triumphs. Winter came with snow and cold, and they spent the short days doing the necessary chores and the long evenings by the fire, planning for spring. Winona proved to be as skilled with accounts as she was with farm work, and together they carefully budgeted their money, deciding what they could afford to invest in improvements and what would have to wait. Spring arrived with mud and rain, and they worked side by side to prepare the fields for planting. Quinn taught Winona to drive the plow team, though she picked it up so quickly he wondered why he'd bothered. She taught him her mother's recipe for butter, which was better than anything he'd ever tasted. They planted wheat again, but also corn and vegetables, expanding the garden until it could feed them and provide surplus to sell in town. Summer brought heat and hard work, but it also brought evenings on the porch with cool water and quiet conversation. They'd sit and watch the sun go down, talking about everything and nothing, comfortable in each other's presence. Sometimes Quinn would play his fiddle and Winona would sing, her voice clear and true. Sometimes they'd just sit in silence, holding hands, watching the fireflies dance. Winona had won over most of independence through sheer determination and competence. When Martha Morrison took sick with fever, Winona was one of the first to show up with soup and offers to help, despite how Martha had treated her. When the church needed someone to organize the Harvest Festival, Winona volunteered and did such a good job that people couldn't help but be impressed. Slowly, steadily, she became not just Mrs. O'Brien, Quinn's wife, but Winona, a valued member of the community in her own right. In late summer, Winona started feeling poorly in the mornings. At first, Quinn worried she was sick, but Sarah Jenkins took one look at her and smiled knowingly. "You're not sick, honey," Sarah said gently. "You're expecting." Winona's eyes went wide, her hand instinctively moving to her still flat stomach. "Are you sure?" "Pretty sure," Sarah said. "Give it a few more weeks and you'll know for certain. How do you feel about it?" Winona looked at Quinn, and the expression on her face was a mixture of joy and terror and wonder. "I think I'm happy," she said slowly. "I think I'm really happy. Quinn found he couldn't speak around the lump in his throat. A child. Their child. The continuation of everything his parents had built, everything he and Winona were building together. He pulled her close and held her tight, feeling her heart beating against his chest. "I'm happy too," he managed finally. "Scared out of my mind, but happy." They told their friends at the Harvest Festival in September, and the news was met with genuine celebration. Even Martha Morrison, recovered from her fever and somewhat humbled by the experience, offered stiff but sincere congratulations. Doc Hartley promised to look after Winona, to make sure she and the baby stayed healthy. The second harvest was even better than the first. They'd learned from the previous year, knew how to work together most efficiently, and the addition of the corn and vegetables meant multiple income streams. Quinn hired a couple of local boys to help with the heaviest work, wanting to spare Winona as much as he could, though she insisted on working almost up until the end. "I'm pregnant, not an invalid," she said tartly, when Quinn suggested she should rest more. "Women have been working through pregnancies since the beginning of time. I'll rest when I need to and work when I can, and that's the end of the discussion." Quinn learned quickly not to argue with her about such things. Winona knew her own body, her own limits, and she'd proven time and again that her judgment was sound. Their son was born in March of 1879, during a late snowstorm that made getting Doc Hartley to the farm an adventure. Sarah Jenkins came to help, and between her and the doctor, they saw Winona through a long, difficult labor. Quinn paced the kitchen, feeling helpless and terrified, listening to Winona's cries and wondering how men ever survived this particular torment of waiting. But then, finally, he heard a baby's cry, thin and reedy but healthy, and Sarah came out with a smile on her face. "You have a son," she said. "Both mother and baby are doing fine. Come on, they want to see you." Quinn entered the bedroom to find Winona propped up against the pillows, exhausted and pale but smiling. In her arms was a tiny bundle, red-faced and squalling, with a shock of dark hair. Quinn approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at his son, feeling his entire world shift to accommodate this new person, this miracle. "He's perfect," Quinn breathed. "He is," Winona agreed. "What should we name him?" They'd discussed names but never quite settled on one. Now, looking at his son, Quinn knew. "Thomas," he said, "after my father, Thomas Quinn O'Brien, if that suits you." "It suits me just fine," Winona said, her eyes shining with tears. "Hello, Thomas. Welcome to the world." Little Thomas was a good baby, healthy and strong-lunged. He kept them up nights with his crying and his need to nurse, but neither Quinn nor Winona minded. They'd take turns walking him when he was fussy, singing to him, talking to him about the farm and the seasons and all the things he'd learn as he grew. Spring planting that year was challenging with a newborn to care for, but they managed. Sarah Jenkins offered to watch Thomas during the busiest days, and Winona would nurse him during breaks, then hand him back and return to work. It wasn't easy, balancing new parenthood with the demands of the farm, but they found a way because that's what they did. They found a way together. The years rolled on, each one bringing its own challenges and joys. Some years the harvest was good, some years it was lean, but they always managed. Quinn and Winona worked side by side through every season, their partnership deepening with each passing year. They added more land when they could afford it, built a new barn when the old one finally gave up, expanded the house to accommodate their growing family. 2 years after Thomas, they had a daughter they named Rose, after Winona's mother. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin, and she was fearless in a way that constantly gave Quinn heart attacks. Then came another son, James, quieter and more thoughtful, who loved books almost as much as he loved the farm. And finally, another daughter, little Catherine, born in 1885, who seemed to be a perfect blend of all of them. Their children grew up working the farm, learning the same lessons Quinn had learned from his father, the same skills Winona had learned from hers. They learned that the land demanded respect and hard work, that nature gave and took away according to its own schedule, that family meant standing together no matter what. Thomas showed an early aptitude for managing the business side of farming, while Rose loved the animals and wanted to raise horses. James was fascinated by new farming techniques he read about in agricultural journals, and Catherine, though young, showed signs of having her mother's gift for organization. Quinn and Winona taught them all to read and write and do figures, sitting around the kitchen table in the evenings with books and slates. Education was important, they believed, even for farm children. Maybe especially for farm children, who needed to understand contracts and markets and weather patterns. Independence grew around them, evolving from a rough frontier town into a proper community. The railroad came through in 1880, making it easier to ship grain to market. More people arrived, more businesses opened, and gradually the wildness of the West was tamed into civilization. But the O'Brien farm remained constant, a steady presence on the outskirts of town, known for the quality of its crops and the integrity of its owners. One evening in the summer of 1890, Quinn and Winona sat on their porch watching the sunset, same as they'd done countless times before. Their children were scattered around the property, doing evening chores or playing, their voices carrying on the warm air. Thomas, now 11, was helping his younger siblings close up the chicken coop. Rose was in the barn with the horses. James was probably reading somewhere, and Catherine was catching fireflies in the yard. "Remember when it was just us?" Quinn asked, taking Winona's hand. "That first harvest, when you showed up on my road like an answer to a prayer." Winona smiled, squeezing his fingers. Her hair had some gray in it now, and there were lines around her eyes from squinting in the sun. But to Quinn she was just as beautiful as the day he'd met her. More so, maybe, because now he knew every facet of her, all the ways she was strong and stubborn and kind. "I remember," she said. "I remember thinking you were either desperate or crazy, offering to hire a woman for field work." "I was desperate," Quinn admitted. "But it was the best decision I ever made. Well, second best. The best was asking you to marry me." "Third best," Winona corrected, her eyes twinkling. "The best was when I said yes." Quinn laughed and pulled her close, kissing her temple. They'd grown into each other over the years, become so intertwined that sometimes it was hard to remember life before. But Quinn didn't need to remember. The past was just context for the present, for the life they'd built together out of hard work and love and faith in each other. "What are you thinking?" Winona asked, echoing that question she'd asked so many times over the years. "I'm thinking I'm grateful," Quinn said. "For you, for our children, for this life. I'm thinking about that summer when I needed help with the harvest, and I found so much more than that. I found a partner for every season of my life, Winona. Spring, summer, fall, and winter, you've been beside me, working with me, building with me. I don't know what I did to deserve you, but I thank God for you every single day." Winona leaned her head on his shoulder. "You didn't have to do anything, Quinn. We found each other because we were both looking for the same thing, even if we didn't know it. A place to belong. A person to belong with. Someone who understood that real partnership isn't about one person serving the other. It's about two people serving a common goal, building something together that neither could build alone." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn from blue to gold to purple. Catherine came running up with her jar of fireflies, wanting to show them before she let the insects go. Thomas called that the chickens were all secure for the night. Rose emerged from the barn covered in horse hair and grinning. James appeared with his nose still in a book, nearly tripping over the porch steps. This was their life, Quinn thought. Not always easy, not without struggles and sorrows, but fundamentally good. Fundamentally theirs. Built from wheat fields and summer heat, from long winter evenings and spring plantings, from the work of their hands and the love in their hearts. As the children clamored for their attention, asking questions and sharing discoveries, Quinn caught Winona's eye and saw his own contentment reflected there. They'd taken a chance on each other that long ago summer, had chosen partnership and built it into something lasting, something that would continue beyond them into the next generation and the one after that. The harvest had brought them together, but it was love that had kept them together through every season since. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Quinn O'Brien knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be, with exactly who he was meant to be with, living exactly the life he was meant to live. Years continued to pass, each one adding its own chapter to the story of the O'Brien family. Thomas grew into a capable young man, taking on more and more responsibility for the farm's business dealings. At 19, he had his father's steady nature and his mother's head for numbers, and Quinn trusted him completely to negotiate with buyers and suppliers. Rose, at 17, had indeed pursued her passion for horses, breeding and training them with a skill that had people coming from neighboring counties to buy from the O'Brien stock. James, 15, had started writing articles for the Agricultural Journal, sharing innovative techniques he'd experimented with on their land. And Catherine, 10 years old, was already showing signs that she'd inherited the best of all of them. Quinn was 43 now, still strong but feeling his age in ways he hadn't a decade ago. His back ached on cold mornings, and he moved a little slower after a full day's work. But he was healthy and happy, surrounded by family and the fruits of decades of labor. The farm had grown to nearly 400 acres, enough that they'd hired on 2 permanent hands to help with the work. Good men who lived in cabins Quinn had built on the property and who were treated more like family than employees. Winona was 40, and Quinn thought she'd only grown more beautiful with age. The work had kept her strong, and there was a confidence about her now, a sureness in her place in the world that came from years of proving herself over and over. She was respected in independence, known as a woman of integrity and capability. She served on the school board, helped organize community events, and was frequently sought out for advice on everything from farming to family matters. One spring morning in 1894, Quinn woke to find Winona already up, standing at the bedroom window and looking out at the farm. He could tell by the set of her shoulders that something was on her mind. "What is it?" he asked, joining her at the window. "I was just thinking," Winona said slowly. "Thomas is 19. He's old enough to run this place without us. Rose could manage the horse operation in her sleep. James is more than capable of handling the planting decisions. Even Catherine knows her way around the farm work." Quinn felt a flutter of concern. "What are you saying?" Winona turned to him, her dark eyes thoughtful. "I'm saying that maybe it's time we started thinking about what comes next for us. Not stopping work entirely, but maybe easing back a little. Letting the children take the lead while we're still here to advise but not having to carry the full weight of it." "You want to retire?" Quinn asked, surprised. Winona had never been one to shy away from work. "Not retire," Winona said. "Just shift. We've been working hard since we were young, Quinn. Don't you ever want to do something just because you want to, not because it needs doing? Travel a little, see some of the country we've never seen. Spend lazy mornings in bed instead of being up before dawn. Have time to just enjoy the life we've built instead of constantly building it." Quinn considered this, looking out at the farm in the early morning light. She had a point. They'd worked so hard for so long, had sacrificed so much to build this place, to raise their children, to establish themselves. Maybe it was time to enjoy the fruits of that labor. "What did you have in mind?" he asked. Winona smiled. "I was thinking we could take a trip. Go see my parents in Chicago. They're getting older and I'd like them to see how well we've done. Then maybe head west, see the mountains I've heard so much about. Just a couple of months, that's all. The children can handle the summer work and we'd be back for harvest if they need us." The idea was both terrifying and thrilling. Quinn had barely left Missouri in his life, had been tied to the farm by necessity and choice. But Winona's eyes were shining with the prospect of adventure, and he found himself wanting to give her this, wanting to experience something new together. "All right," he said. "Let's do it. Let's go on an adventure." They talked to the children that evening, laying out their plan. Thomas was confident he could handle the business. Rose promised the horses would be well cared for. James assured them his planting scheme would work perfectly. and Catherine declared she'd make sure everyone remembered to eat proper meals. Their confidence was touching and a little bittersweet. Quinn realized his children didn't really need him anymore, not in the way they once had. They'd grown into capable adults, ready to take on the world. In June, after the planting was done and the crops were established, Quinn and Winona boarded a train heading east. It was the first time either of them had been on a train, and the speed of it was exhilarating and a little frightening. They watched the landscape rush past the window, fields and towns and rivers, marveling at how quickly they covered ground that would have taken weeks by wagon. Chicago was overwhelming in its size and noise and crowds. Winona's parents were living in a small apartment in a working-class neighborhood, and the reunion was emotional. Her father, Michael Parker, was grayer and thinner than Winona remembered, aged by years of factory work. Her mother, Rose, for whom their daughter was named, was worn but still had a spark of the strength Winona had inherited. Her brother Daniel and his wife Anna lived nearby with their 3 children, and the family gathered for a big dinner that filled the small apartment with warmth and noise. "You've done well for yourself, Winnie," Michael said, using his old nickname for her. "I always knew you would. You've got your mother's strength and your own fire besides. This man of yours, he treats you right." "Better than I could have hoped for, Papa," Winona said, squeezing Quinn's hand under the table. They stayed in Chicago for a week, and Quinn could see the mixture of emotions in Winona. She was glad to see her family, but the city chafed at her. She missed the open spaces, the clean air, the quiet. On their last day, walking through a park that was a pale imitation of the countryside they loved, Winona spoke what they were both feeling. "I made the right choice," she said. "Leaving, I mean. I love my family, but this isn't the life for me. The farm, our farm, that's home." "It is," Quinn agreed. "But I'm glad we came. Your parents needed to see you happy and successful. They needed to know you're all right." From Chicago, they headed west by train, switching lines multiple times as they made their way toward the Rocky Mountains. They stopped in small towns along the way, talking to farmers and ranchers, learning about different approaches to agriculture, different challenges and opportunities. Everywhere they went, Quinn and Winona found common ground with the people they met, the shared understanding of those who worked the land. The mountains, when they finally reached them, were breathtaking. They hired a guide and spent a week camping in the foothills of Colorado, surrounded by peaks that seemed to touch the sky. Quinn had never imagined such grandeur existed, never dreamed he'd see it in person. They hiked through pine forests, fished in crystal-clear streams, and spent nights under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. "This is beautiful," Winona said one night, lying beside Quinn in their tent. "But it makes me miss home. Isn't that strange? All these years I spent wanting to see the West, and now that I'm here, I realize I like my little corner of Missouri just fine." "It's not strange," Quinn said. "We spent 20 years building something. That kind of investment, that kind of work, it roots you to a place. The mountains are beautiful, but they're not ours. Our fields, our barn, our house, those are ours. We made them what they are." They started the journey home in early August, wanting to be back before harvest began. The train ride seemed shorter on the return, perhaps because they knew what to expect, or perhaps because they were eager to get home. When they finally pulled into Independence, Thomas was waiting at the station with the wagon, grinning broadly. "How was your trip?" he asked, loading their bags. "Wonderful," Winona said. "But we're glad to be home. How's everything here?" "Perfect," Thomas said. "The crops look good. Rose sold 2 horses for excellent prices. James's new irrigation technique is working better than expected, and Catherine has appointed herself farm manager in your absence." She's been bossing everyone around like a tiny general." They laughed, and Quinn felt the last piece of tension he hadn't known he was carrying release. The farm was fine. The children were fine. Everything was exactly as it should be. That harvest was one of the best they'd ever had. The combination of good weather and James's innovations producing yields that exceeded their most optimistic projections. Quinn and Winona worked alongside their children, all 6 of them moving through the fields in a coordinated dance perfected over years of practice. Watching his sons and daughters work, seeing their competence and confidence, Quinn felt a deep sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with the size of the harvest. In the evenings, they'd gather around the big table Quinn had built years ago, eating dinner and talking about the day. Thomas would report on the buyers he'd contacted. Rose would share news about a mare that was due to foal. James would explain some new technique he'd read about, and Catherine would keep everyone organized and on track. Winona would add her observations and suggestions, and Quinn would sit at the head of the table, mostly listening, marveling at the family they'd created. One night, after the children had dispersed to their evening activities, Quinn and Winona remained at the table, finishing their coffee. "We did good," Quinn said simply. "We did," Winona agreed. "Not just with the farm, but with them. They're good people, Quinn, kind and hard-working and decent. That's the real harvest, I think. Not wheat or corn, but children who have grown into adults we're proud of." "I couldn't have done it without you," Quinn said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "None of it. You're still the best partner I could have asked for, Winona O'Brien, for every season of life." Winona's eyes grew misty. "You're going to make me cry, and I'm too old and tough for that nonsense." "You can be tough and still cry," Quinn said gently. "You taught me that, remember? That strength isn't about never showing emotion, it's about being brave enough to feel things deeply and keep going anyway." They sat there in the lamplight, hands clasped, comfortable in the silence that came from years of knowing each other. Outside, the farm settled into night, the sounds of animals and wind and distant voices creating a symphony that was as familiar as breathing. The years that followed were gentler, the pace more measured. Quinn and Winona gradually transferred more responsibility to their children, moving from active management to advisory roles. Thomas took over most of the day-to-day operations, with his siblings handling their respective areas of expertise. Quinn and Winona were still involved, still worked when the work needed doing, but they also took time for themselves. They'd spend mornings sometimes just sitting on the porch with their coffee, watching the sun rise over fields they'd planted decades ago. They'd take afternoon walks, exploring corners of their own property they'd been too busy to visit. They'd sit up late talking about everything and nothing, revisiting memories and making new ones. In 1898, Thomas married a local girl named Elizabeth, a schoolteacher with a quick mind and a kind heart. They moved into the cabin where Winona had first stayed, which had been expanded and improved over the years. Their first child, a son they named Quinn after his grandfather, was born the following year, and holding his grandson for the first time, Quinn felt the circle of life complete itself in a way that was both humbling and profound. Rose surprised everyone by falling in love with one of the hired hands, a quiet young man named Jacob, who was as skilled with horses as she was. Quinn and Winona gave them their blessing and a portion of land to start their own horse farm, close enough to visit but far enough to be independent. James married a girl he'd met at an agricultural fair, a farmer's daughter who shared his passion for innovation. They took over the northern section of the property, experimenting with new crops and techniques. Even young Catherine, just 16, already had a bow. the son of the town doctor, a smart young man who seemed properly intimidated by her competence. Sitting on the porch one evening in the summer of 1900, surrounded by children and grandchildren, Quinn looked at Winona and saw his whole life reflected in her smile. 23 years since that day, she'd walked up his road, dusty and determined, looking for work. 23 years of planting and harvest, of struggles overcome and joys shared. 23 years of partnership, of love that had only deepened with time. "What are you thinking?" Winona asked, and Quinn realized he'd been staring. "I'm thinking about that first summer," he said, "when I needed help with the harvest and found so much more. I'm thinking about all the seasons we've been through together, all the years we've worked side by side. I'm thinking that if I could go back and tell my younger self what his life would become, he'd never believe it. He was so worried, so desperate, thinking he was about to lose everything. He couldn't have imagined this." Quinn gestured at the scene around them. Thomas and Elizabeth chasing their toddler across the yard. Rose and Jacob discussing bloodlines and training techniques. James and his wife Martha arguing good-naturedly about seed varieties. Catherine sitting with her young man, laughing at something he'd said. The farm stretching out in every direction, productive and prosperous. The house full of life and laughter. "He couldn't have imagined you," Quinn continued, looking back at Winona. "The woman who would walk into his life and change everything. The partner who would work beside him through every season, who would build this life with him one day, one choice, one act of love at a time." Winona's eyes were bright with tears now, and she made no effort to hide them. "Oh, Quinn, you're going to make me ruin my reputation as a tough old farmer." "You are tough," Quinn said, "but you're also the kindest, most loving person I've ever known. You're both things at once, and that's just one of the 1,000 reasons I love you." Catherine looked over at them and called out, "Are you two being mushy again? Because it's embarrassing for us." The whole group laughed, and Quinn felt his cheeks heat, but he didn't care. Let them be embarrassed. He had a right to be mushy with his wife, especially when she'd given him such a remarkable life. As the evening deepened into night and their children began gathering their families to head home, Quinn and Winona remained on the porch, as they had so many nights before. The fireflies were out, dancing in the warm air, and somewhere in the distance a whippoorwill was calling. 23 years, Winona said softly. "Where did they go?" "Into this," Quinn said, gesturing at the farm, the house, the remnants of the family gathering. "Into building something that will last beyond us. Into raising children who'll do the same. That's where the years went, and I don't regret a single one of them." "Neither do I," Winona said. She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, holding her close. "You know what the best part is? We still have more seasons ahead of us. More years to work together, to love each other, to watch our grandchildren grow. We're not done yet." "No," Quinn agreed. "We're not done yet." They sat there as the stars came out, as the sounds of the farm settled into night rhythms, as the world turned and seasons changed, and life continued its eternal cycle. They sat together, as they had for over 2 decades, as they would for all the years remaining to them. Partners in work, partners in love, partners in every season of life. The harvest had brought them together, but it was their choice to stay together, to build together, to love together that had created this life. And as Quinn held Winona close under the Missouri stars, he knew with absolute certainty that he wouldn't change a single moment of it. Not the hard times or the good times, not the struggles or the triumphs. All of it had been necessary. All of it had mattered. All of it had led to this perfect moment of contentment and love. He'd needed help with the harvest all those years ago, and he'd found it. But more than that, he'd found a partner for every season of his life, and that had made all the difference.